Gerrymandering, voter suppression, we hear these words tossed around a lot. But what do they actually mean? And why do they matter so much for our democracy? Now, in case you live under a rock, there's been quite a bit of gerrymandering in Texas and California lately. And I did a whole separate video explaining what's going on in those states. But today we're going to talk about gerrymandering and voter suppression. What do they mean? What's the difference? So by the end of this episode, you should be able to understand how both of these terms impact elections clearly. Now, before we dive in, I'd like to remind you, please like and subscribe this video. It helps with the algorithm. You can also find me on Patreon and support me there. And this episode is brought to you in partnership with Ground News. Ground News lets you see how different media outlets cover the same stories, helping you spot bias and get the full picture. I only partner with brands that align with For Love and Justice's mission, and Ground News is a perfect fit. Informed, intentional, and rooted in critical thinking. Sign up today and start seeing the news differently. Now, what is gerrymandering? Essentially, it means manipulating district boundaries to favor one party or group. Where did the term come from? It's actually a funny story. So the term gerrymandering comes from the name of Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry, who in 1812 signed a redistricting bill creating oddly shaped electoral districts. One of these districts was lampooned in a political cartoon in the Boston Gazette as resembling a winged salamander. So gerrymandering is essentially combining Gerry with salamander. Gerrymander. And what does voter suppression mean? Basically, voter suppression is deliberate actions or policies that make it harder for certain people to vote. Examples include strict voter ID laws, polling place closures, voter roll purges, and most recently, Trump has been trying to get rid of mail-in ballots, which our military uses. So back to gerrymandering. How does it work? Basically, we have a census every 10 years, and after that census, we redraw maps. Currently, the Texas GOP is trying to redraw mid-census. And like I said, I unpacked that in my episode about what's going on in Texas and California. So be sure to tune into that. Gerrymandering comes down to basically what we call packing and cracking. So packing involves overstuffing one district with like-minded voters to reduce their influence elsewhere. And cracking means spreading those voters so thin across districts that they never form a majority. Again, check out that video on what's going on in Texas because it is crazy. Their maps, the major cities like Houston and Dallas and Austin are basically tiny, itty-bitty little blue dots, even though they make up the majority of the state's economy. So who benefits from gerrymandering? Basically, incumbents and the party in power, the people redrawing the maps, are the ones who benefit. How does this work? So essentially, a party that wins just 50% of the statewide vote might end up with 65 to 70% of the seats. I'm not great at math, but that math is not mathing. Doesn't sound right, does it? So who's harmed when it comes to gerrymandering? Basically everyone but them. Voters, people of color, and democracy itself. People lose the ability to choose representatives who reflect their communities. Their votes can feel meaningless if their district is packed or cracked, so this leads to voter apathy, low voter turnout. And historically, gerrymandering has been used to dilute the political power of Black, Latino, Asian, and Indigenous communities. Even when they make up large, cohesive populations, map drawing can split or overconcentrate them, limiting representation. Competitive elections shrink. Our reputation for being the greatest democracy in the world shrinks. Trust in the system erodes, and people disengage when they feel like their vote doesn't matter. We saw this in 2024. There was a lot of apathy. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it was not a great turnout. And now we have Trump. So a high-profile example of gerrymandering would be what's going on in Texas and California now, but we can also look back to a few years ago for some more examples. So in 2018 in North Carolina, Democrats won about 50% of the statewide vote, but they only got 3 out of 13 seats, which is about 23%. Because the map was drawn to crack Democratic voters across multiple districts so they couldn't form majorities. And also in 2018 in Wisconsin, Democrats won 53% of the vote statewide, while Republicans won 63 of 99 seats, about 64%. Again, the math is not mathing. And in Maryland in 2012, this is an example of it's not always Republicans doing it, right? Both sides gerrymander. This has been done for decades and decades and decades. So in 2012, Republicans won about 37% of this vote statewide. They only got 1 out of 8 seats, which is about 12%. Because Democrats had drawn the map to crack Republican voters into multiple districts, minimizing their influence. And in Texas in 2022, after the 2020 census, Texas gained 2 new congressional seats. Most of the population growth came from Latino, Black, and Asian communities, but instead of drawing new majority-minority districts, map drawers spread those voters across multiple districts, reducing their chance to elect candidates of choice, suppressing their representation. Now, voter suppression has a long, dark, ugly history, so let's take a little deep dive into the roots. After Reconstruction, Southern states systematically blocked Black Americans from voting through literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses. These were often administered subjectively, with white voters being passed and Black voters being failed. Jim Crow laws codified racial disenfranchisement, and violence and intimidation at the polls was very common. It took the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to outlaw many of these discriminatory practices, but the fight didn't end there. Some modern tactics of voter suppression: we have reduced early voting windows. Cutting down the number of days or hours people can vote early, especially harms hourly workers, caregivers, and people with limited transportation. An example, in Georgia, lawmakers passed restrictions reducing ballot drop boxes and early voting access after record turnout in 2020. Strict voter ID requirements. Supporters claim it prevents fraud, but studies consistently show voter impersonation is almost non-existent. These laws disproportionately affect low-income, elderly, and minority voters who may not have easy access to government-issued IDs. Limiting mail-in voting. During the pandemic, vote by mail became essential. It's also always been essential for Americans overseas and military members overseas. But since the pandemic, several states have tightened the rules, like requiring extra witness signatures, banning ballot drop-offs, and making it harder to request an absentee ballot. And then there are also fewer polling places in communities of color. Closing polling location leads to hours-long wait times, and research from the Brennan Center shows Black and Latino voters are far more likely to wait over 30 minutes to vote compared to white voters. Again, this has to do with where you live, what's available. Now, Voting Rights Act rollbacks. So we talked about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Well, in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted a key part of the Voting Rights Act, the requirement that states with a history of discrimination get federal pre-clearance before changing voting laws. This was Shelby County versus Holder in 2013. Almost immediately, states like Texas and North Carolina implemented restrictive ID laws and cut voting access measures previously blocked under the VRA. So what's the real impact of all this voter suppression? Voter suppression is the impact. Longer lines, fewer options, and more barriers means lower turnout, and the burden falls disproportionately on Black voters, young voters, disabled voters, and poor communities. This isn't abstract. A 2020 MIT study found that Latino and Black voters waited 46% longer on average at polling sites than white voters. Long waits themselves can suppress voters, especially for people who can't take hours off work. And, now we have the laws about you can't pass out water, making it even harder to stay there for hours. The result is a democracy that doesn't represent everyone equally, where who gets to vote often depends on where you live, your income, and your race. So let's compare the two. We have gerrymandering and we have voter suppression, and they go hand in hand. So gerrymandering manipulates maps. Voter suppression manipulates access. Both undermine democratic representation, just in different ways. Together, they reinforce each other. Suppressed voters in already gerrymandered districts face double barriers. Now, why does this matter in America, right? We have free and fair elections. We have a pretty big reputation for having free and fair elections. Tactics like gerrymandering and voter suppression erode trust in our democracy. And it creates voter apathy. Not as many people are going to turn out to the polls. Not as many people, we've always had this issue of people don't think their vote counts. Well, now they know it doesn't. Democracy just works better when people participate fairly. And to those who say we don't have a democracy, we have a republic, we have a constitutional republic, and the people are supposed to represent our vote. That's the democracy part of it. It's not happening, but we'll get to my dark money episode coming soon. So what can be done? Even though gerrymandering and voter suppression feel like giant, impossible problems, there are real solutions. Independent redistricting commissions. Instead of letting politicians draw their own districts, some states have created independent or bipartisan commissions to do it. The idea is to take power away from the people who have a direct stake in the outcome. An example of this, in California and Michigan, they both use independent commissions, which has led to more competitive races and fairer representation. It's not a perfect fix, but it's a lot better than foxes guarding the henhouse. We can also tighten up our voting rights legislation. On the federal level, bills like the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would restore and strengthen protections that the Supreme Court weakened in Shelby County versus Holder 2013. It would require states with a history of discrimination to get federal approval before changing their voting laws. Other proposals, like the Freedom to Vote Act, would set national standards for early voting, vote by mail, and automatic voter registration. These kinds of laws would make voter suppression tactics much harder to pull off. There are also state-level protections and ballot initiatives, so when Congress stalls, states can step it up. Some states have passed their own Voting Rights Act, like New York and Virginia, which protect against discrimination in local elections. Voters can also take matters into their own hands through ballot initiatives. In places like Michigan and Colorado, citizens directly voted to create independent redistricting commissions. This shows that change doesn't always have to come from Washington. It can start locally. You can also contribute to public pressure and grassroots organizing. Politicians respond when people pay attention. Public outrage over unfair maps and voter suppression has already forced courts and legislatures to act. Call your senators, call your representatives. Grassroots groups are doing the on-the-ground work, registering voters, challenging bad maps in court, and making sure communities know their rights. So find these local grassroots organizations and support them, monetarily or with your time. Supporting these efforts, whether by volunteering, donating, or simply amplifying them on social media, literally just sharing it to your Instagram story with your followers, it makes a real difference. At the end of the day, these problems aren't abstract. They're about whether your vote actually counts. The good news is there are some fixes, from commissions to laws to grassroots movements, and they all share the same goal: putting power back in the hands of the people where it belongs. Thank you for listening to this episode of For Love and Justice. Your call to action is to register to vote, check polling info, support fair maps initiatives, and share this episode. And don't forget to like and subscribe.
You think you just fell out of a coconut tree? You exist in the context of all in which you live and what came before you.